So welcome everyone again to teaching about Middle Eastern history and world history courses with Dr. Alan Fromherz, which is organized again by the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies and the Center for Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Michigan. Dr. Fromherz is professor of history and the director of the Middle East Studies Center at Georgia State University. He has a passion for teaching and teaching not only students, but the general public, as well as educators about the region, and has done much work in terms of developing new courses, as well as directing different study abroad programs on the region. And we're so thrilled to have him here with us this evening. So Professor Fromherz, I will turn it over to you.
And thank you. I'm so happy to be a part of this. First, I want to thank Emma and Rima and Kristen for being such wonderful hostesses and for inviting me to be a part of this really valuable project. And pedagogy, I think, is really deserves a lot more attention, because I think it's through pedagogy that we can communicate not only some of the known ideas or known facts and figures about the past, but really get students engaged. I guess I was muted. Oh dear.
Just for a little blip right there.
Oh, okay. So I think that's really how you can get your students excited, because so often I think you have a textbook about world history. It looks like there's a bunch of facts and figures. Oh, I need to memorize this. Students get afraid of dates. They get afraid of facts. So they think, oh, it's just about learning this approach. But in fact, history is a very vigorous, interesting, active debate. And that's how I teach my world history class. That there isn't just one answer to questions about the past, to important questions about the past. There are many different approaches and many different answers, depending on your point of view, depending on the perspective or what evidence you look at. And that's very relevant with Middle East history as well. A little bit about my background here. I am back when I was 25. Sitting on a rampart on a wall in Syria with my little Arabic insignia there on my badge from Dartmouth College Arabic program. I have spent many years living in the Middle East. I'm obviously not from the Middle East. I don't have a Middle East background, but I did a Fulbright scholarship and many other research scholarships in the Middle East. I grew passionate about the Middle East from a mentor at Dartmouth College. And in these many years living in the Middle East, I fell in love with the region and the people. And one thing I really noticed that I think people here in the US who don't have a chance to visit the Middle East don't get a chance to notice is there's so much more to the region than what we hear in the news. Than these categories that we're given of extremists or non-extremists or Shiite and Sunni or Muslim and non-Muslim, that the diversity and beauty of this part of the world is really astonishing. And the history of that diversity and beauty is inspiring as well. What's also somewhat frustrating, though, for teachers of Middle East and even world history, is that it's still relatively unknown, especially among the general public. So that's why I think it's so vital to include Middle East history in your world history curriculum, not just as a subsidiary or as a secondary unit, but as a core unit, as a core way of understanding certain crucial questions in world history generally. And that the tools for doing that is what I'm going to try to do for you with this presentation. So there's three themes and approaches that I'm going to follow here. I hope we can get through all three of them, but you'll have the slides available if we don't have the time to get through all of them. The first unit Because I think anybody who teaches world history, especially pre-1500, you are going to need to talk about the Prophet Muhammad. You're going to need to talk about the great revolution that occurred in the 7th century that changed the world with the Prophet Muhammad and his revelations of the Quran. So how can you use that to talk about even larger issues in world history? So the charisma of the Prophet, we'll be talking about that under change. Contact. So if you have more time, if you have more than a week to focus on the Middle East, I recommend using another really charismatic person who provides a really rich primary source that has been translated into English. And this is Ibn Battuta, the great traveler who traveled around not only the Middle East, but also all the way to Asia, to Canton and Africa. And it gives students an idea that, well, Islam is not just focused in the Middle East, that the impact of the rise of Islam spread throughout the world. And then continuity, if we have even yet more time, you can talk about certain patterns within Middle East history over the long term. And the historiography, or the study of the history of the Middle East, with great historians like Ibn Khaldun. This picture here, I just want to briefly mention, it's from Palmyra. I had the chance of visiting Palmyra, or Tadmor, before, as you might know from the news, this great ancient site was destroyed by ISIS. That's the very arch that was destroyed by ISIS. It was extremely high, much higher than other arches, for the camel caravans that come through. So I think it's fun little quote, fun little facts. So one thing you want, I think, to do with your pedagogy that I think has been successful for me is, especially with the online space as well, to always have a primary source reading. So each unit or each theme that I'm going to present to you will have primary source readings or primary source resources. Then a discussion activity. So you can use the discussion board if you're doing it online, or have a discussion, of course, in person once we are allowed to do that again, hopefully. And then you have, of course, your evaluation exam that again, the individual student will complete. As I mentioned earlier, these units are based upon how much time you have within your world history curriculum or within your class. If you have only 1 week, I recommend you focus on the transformations that the rise of Islam brought about with the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and that you focus on these issues of the role of charisma in world history. I think it's an ideal time to bring up that topic. So if you have 2 to 3 weeks, you can go to Battuta and then further. So the first unit, and this question of change and how change happens in history and what provokes change. What are the most important factors in provoking great change? And the rise of Islam is perhaps even more than any other event potentially in world history, other than maybe the rise of Christianity or other great world religions, is an ideal example of this question of change, of addressing the question of change. So how do you teach about change? Well, you talk about how things were before and after. So if we look at the time before Islam, in Arabic, there's actually a term for this. And if you think you have the bandwidth, or your students can pick it up, the word is jahiliya. Jahiliya. It means the age of ignorance. And that gives you a sense, especially among Muslims, of most Muslims in the world. I want to say all Muslims, but most Muslims around the world, of this these two different eras, right? There's the time before the prophet, which was the time of darkness, of ignorance, and the time after the prophet, a time of enlightenment and realization, right? So it's as if history, all of history gets split into these two categories because of the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, there are many accounts of this Jahiliyyah period, and they show, for example, that before the Prophet and his revelations, before the coming of Islam, the women's rights were much worse. Right? So if a child were born, for example, and she didn't have a protector, they could simply be buried in the sand. And there's actually surahs of the Quran that talk about this, because girls were not valued by the society of pre-Islamic Arabia. There was no rule of law, so it was might above right, and I think that's something that's interesting to talk about. I know that we have current debates about the role of police in society and the role of law, but if you think about, well, how would you, who would you go to if there were no legal system? Not only if there were fewer police, but if there were no police or no laws at all, who would protect you? It would be based on the strength of your family, the strength of your tribe. And that's pretty much how justice worked before the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. It was based on who you knew, and not your individual rights or of your position as an individual. So the coming of Islam, by making one's belief as an individual, one's individual belief in God important, actually allowed the individual to have a certain place and certain rights and laws protecting him or her. Before Islam, there were many different gods for each of these tribes. Each of these tribal groups had their own pagan god, and they would bring them together in Mecca during a fair when fighting was supposed to stop, right? And get together in Mecca, and they would read poems and compete with one another, and they weren't supposed to fight during that holy month. In fact, that later becomes the tradition of Ramadan. So there's also a lot of illiteracy, a great amount of illiteracy. In fact, one of the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad was that he himself was illiterate, right? That this great figure of world history didn't know how to read or write. And that's one of the miracles of the Quran, that when it was revealed to him, it wasn't as if he just wrote it up himself. It was revealed to him from God, right? So after Islam, we have this huge change in world history, right? We have the collapse of two of the mega superpowers that had been in charge of the world, of all of Eurasia, not just for centuries or decades, but really for a millennium. Because if you look back in time, all the way back to, if you had taught ancient Persia, if you taught the Thucydides, the 500 of the Persians, the Greeks and the Persians have been fighting each other for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before this. And with the rise of Islam, both of those empires Byzantium became extremely weak. It was almost conquered. Constantinople was almost taken over with the initial conquest, and Persia disappeared. It was incredibly, for everybody who was alive at that time, it collapsed in the face of the Arab conquests, right? And you can see that here in this map, that the Arab conquest really grew as in a wedge between these two empires that had for a century, even before the great Sasanian Byzantine wars, right, where you had one fighting the other, and they were going back and forth, and actually using the Arabs as mercenaries between them. The Arabs, once they became united, had the ability to come between these two weakened empires, and with the unity that the Prophet Muhammad provided, conquer both, right, and take over territory in both empires. So that was a major change in geopolitical history, but also in cultural history as well. We have Arabic suddenly transformed from a primarily oral language that was used by poets in the desert and in caravans in some trading cities to a world language, right? That knowledge of Arabic was necessary in order to truly read the Quran, because the Quran in its true form can only be known in Arabic. That's why one memorizes the Quran in Arabic. A translation of the Quran into another language is not actually considered a translation. It's considered an interpretation, because only in Arabic is the Quran actually real, according to Islamic belief. So what really happened with the rise of Islam was not, one should say, the complete destruction of Persian or Byzantine culture, however, but really a dialectic, so a reconciliation or bringing together of both cultures, which came to influence Islamic civilization and culture as well. So although they were conquered, Islam and the Abbasid Empire, the Umayyad empires that grew out of Islam, were influenced heavily by Persian and Greek precedents. So you went from women, for example, being buried in the sand to having the right to inherit, that every individual had a sense of rights as a believer within Islam. There were still many things that we today would consider to be problematic or at issue. You know, slavery was not completely banned by the coming of Islam. Slavery was still allowed. Women were not given completely equal rights as men. They did inherit as much as men, but they did inherit something. So it's important not to overstate and say, oh, well, it just became, you know, like Denmark all of a sudden in the 21st century, but it was a revolutionary change for the time. And there's even this sense among modern Muslim scholars, especially living within the West, that the intention of the Prophet Muhammad is very important here, that he changed women's rights for the better. So if we do more of that, that's actually a good thing. We are following the intentions, the niyyah of the Prophet Muhammad. No longer is the tribe the basis of one's identity or the means of protection, but this new dispensation, this Islamic law based on the revelations of the Quran. So how and why does this all happen? And this is where you really, I think, do need to teach some important facts. I think you do need to tell Christians about the biography of the Prophet Muhammad for the purpose of this unit as well. And I recommend focusing on certain key aspects of his life, because there's quite a lot of material on the life of the Prophet Muhammad. I think it's important to mention the birth and early life of the Prophet, the fact that he came from a noble lineage, right, a noble background, but he himself was poor and was an orphan. So he has that aspect of a hero's journey. You could even, if you want to, sort of mention the Joseph Campbell and Star Wars and all these other ideas. You know, there's these patterns of who a hero or charismatic person is that you can mention. So we don't even know what date he was born, because there's many disputes about his early life, and it wasn't really written down. He lived a rather unfortunate existence in his early life. He had the protection of his uncle Abu Talib, who actually never converted to Islam. But when his uncle died, he lost that protection of the tribe and was vulnerable to being killed, actually, for his beliefs, for his revelations, which came to him around 610 CE. And this is a very important story. He went out of the city, went to a cave all by himself, right? So there's this focus on this individual, right, of one person. coming into contact with God. The archangel Gabriel came to him with a message saying, Ikra, recite in the name of your God. So it's the power of the individual and his relationship with a God that kind of breaks into human history. He performs miracles, which is also oftentimes a part of the hero's journey. He is oppressed by the society around him. People reject his revelations. They reject, many people reject, especially the social structure of the tribal structure of Mecca rejects him. That's another aspect that we see. For example, when Jesus was preaching, the social structure around him also rejected him, right? And he goes on a night journey. He goes to Jerusalem. He goes and visits God and the previous prophets and restores what's called the religion of Abraham, what Muslims believe to be the pure faith and pure monotheism of Abraham. Another extremely important date, of course, is the Hijra, 622, which is the beginning of the Islamic calendar. So kind of like the Christian calendar, AD means Anno Domini. It's based on what Christians believed was the birth of Jesus in 0 AD or 1 AD, so Anno Domini. In the same way with Islam, we have 622. This was when the Prophet left Mecca and took his followers and went to Medina, a city north of Mecca, and actually established a state and a society there with laws and so on. You can distinguish between the revelations of the Quran to the Prophet when he was in Mecca, which are more spiritual and about the end of times, more abstract, and then the Medina surahs, which talk about laws and regulations and more specific ideas about how you live within a society, and a very diverse society it was. There were not just Muslims, there are people who are followers of the Prophet, but also Jews and Christians and pagans who lived under the Prophet. And he wasn't a complete dictator or something. He was actually called a hakim, or a judge, who's brought in to resolve disputes between these many different groups. And then, of course, we have the death and final sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, which we'll talk about later as one of your resources. 632. So this is really big history stuff, right? The Prophet Muhammad even becomes so important to world history that you can see him appear here on the frieze of the Supreme Court of the United States as a supreme lawgiver, right? And along with Moses, Jesus, Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha, he is one of the most influential, but also in the most least understood persons of human history. But he does provide this link between humanity and divinity. And I think it calls into question, to what extent can individuals really change the course of the world and of world history? And if you wanted to make an argument that individuals can do that, I think you have no better candidate for that than the Prophet Muhammad. So this is where I think you can teach the concept of charisma to your students and the role of charisma in world history and debates about the role of charisma in world history. Can you as an individual change history? Or are we really just little cogs in the wheel and everybody just does their thing, but it's all determined by, geography or happenstance or right place or right time? What makes a person charismatic? What's interesting is that charisma was around in this period among speakers in Greek. It came from the New Testament. St. Paul actually introduced the word charisma. It meant a gift of grace or something that the Holy Spirit gave to a particular individual, allowing them to communicate something divine or something from God. And what elements of the prophet's life journey repeated that of other prophets or other heroes before him. And this is where you can kind of ask your students, what are some examples of men and women who were charismatic even before the prophet Muhammad? You could talk about Alexander the Great, for example, or Julius Caesar. You could talk about Zenobia, who was the queen, or even Mary, the mother of Jesus as well. I think it's important to say that women can be charismatic as well. Unfortunately, I think there's been an overemphasis on men as the great charismatic heroes. I think you can bring in even some more advanced sociology and historiography. This quote from Max Weber defining charismatic authority as a certain quality of an individual personality by which he's treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman powers. And you can talk about, well, is charisma, is it always positive for all people, or is it also sometimes negative, right? And there are some negative charismatic authorities. We've seen perhaps the influence of some recently, and in the 20th century and in the 21st century as well. And it depends on which, if you are a member of the group that is being led by this charismatic authority or not. But those who believe in the charismatic authority tend to think that all the standards of the time have broken up, right? So the laws of the past no longer apply. It's as if the world flips upside down, right? And the normal standards and normal ways of things are completely opposite of what they should be. In fact, most charismatic authorities break the law all the time. That is part of the purpose, right? Is to show that the law itself is broken by breaking it. And they survive that trial and come out to create a new dispensation or a new law, a new way of life. And that's how change happens. So why was Islam so successful? Well, I think there's more than just the charisma of the Prophet Muhammad. And this is where the argument and the debate comes in, the discussion can come in with your students. The rise of Islam and the Arab conquest for the Byzantines and the Persians, they did not expect this at all. Neither did the Ethiopians, by the way. Everybody was just assumed that the Arabs were these pagan barbarians at the very edge of civilization. They didn't. How could they have the means to take over the seat of the Shah? It was inconceivable to them. And because it was so unexpected, it allowed them yet more of a surprise attack on these empires. Also, as I mentioned before, the Byzantine and Persian empires were completely exhausted by one another. Up through the life of the Prophet Muhammad, Heraclius and the Byzantine emperor and the Shahs of Iran, Yazdegerd, and so on, where one would invade and sack the capital city of the other and go back and forth. Their troops were completely were no longer being paid. They weren't paying the Arab mercenaries anymore, which was a mistake. Always pay your mercenaries. If you have them, pay your mercenaries. What's also interesting, and this is the Arabs had kind of this new technology, and one of the most important historians of world historians, his name is Richard Bulliet, 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 or it's how it seems to be spelled, Richard Bulliet. He makes this theory that in fact it was the camel and the invention of the camel stirrup and the military stirrup that stabilized camel warriors that really gave Arabs a huge advantage, right? That camel transportation and the advancement of that camel transportation. There were camels long before, of course, as well, but it was actually superior to wheel transportation. Why is that? You didn't have to have a road. You just had to have the open desert. And it completely changed the way ports and commerce and economy and linkages between cities worked. And that also made cities unexpected because they tend to build their walls on the seaside, not on the desert side. But the desert side was where the Arabs were coming from, right? So you have all of these reasons of geography and being in the right place in the right time as well. But then you also, of course, have the reason of the prophet's charisma and the revelations of the Quran itself. So the question is, which perspective, right? And is there a right answer to which one is most important or which one was more crucial than the other in causing this change? And this is where I think you can get your students to think about making an argument. And something important here, and I want you to read this at the bottom with the red type. You may have students in your classroom who come from a Muslim tradition. So you're talking about their own culture and history. So it's important to, when realizing that, to be sensitive to those religious beliefs and to maybe repeat and to emphasize that we're not challenging whether the Prophet Muhammad or the Quran is important. We're just showing that there are multiple perspectives about how different factors can be important in explaining this change. So I think that's something important to think about. What I wouldn't do is necessarily force students in their individual assignments to take a particular point of view, either for or against the charisma of the prophet. What I would encourage you to do, though, is to avoid these kind of damp squib arguments that I get from a lot of students sometimes, where it's like, there were multiple factors that caused the change. I'm like, yeah, we all know that. The multiple factors argument is fine, but at the same time, you're not really making an argument, are you? You're just saying, oh, I don't want to make a stand because I don't want to be wrong. I think it's important to use this as a chance for students to realize that there isn't a wrong answer, that you can make an argument that the charisma of the Prophet Muhammad and the revelations of the Quran are the most important factor, or you can make an argument that is geographical position, that it was the Arabs being in the right place at the right time. You can make an argument for the importance of any of these factors without saying that one was factually the most important, because historians don't know that. We don't have the information to know which of these is true. Even if it happened yesterday, we wouldn't have the information to know what is true. Right? And that's part of this art and science of history, that there are objective and subjective pieces of evidence and arguments that can be made simultaneously. Okay. So there's the charisma argument, and then there's the right place, right time argument, with this little proviso that you always keep in mind respect and consideration of the beliefs of the people in your classroom. So what does this do when you engage in this type of discussion, right? You get students to think like college students, which is really your goal, to prepare them for college. And when you are in university, you need to learn how to make a thesis, how to make an argument. If you are not making an original thesis or argument, your professor will say, well, what are you contributing here? You're just regurgitating the information that you got from the web or from the textbook. This is not a worthy work. This is maybe C+ work. So you're getting them engaged in critical thinking beyond dates and figures to questions that really matter and how you can address these questions. To go beyond these, oh, there were many factors types of arguments, to how do you make an argument for one factor, right? Just in the same way that a lawyer in a courtroom could make an argument for the defense or for the prosecution, but you have to choose either one of those, right? And in life generally, after school, you have to kind of take a side when it comes to certain positions in advancing grant applications and advancing sales or marketing materials, anything. And I think another crucial skill that you learned from this is dealing with counter evidence. So you don't only need to consider your argument, but also the other argument and how your evidence or your position reacts to or responds to that. So this is part of teaching to students this notion that history is beyond your textbook. History is a conversation. Your textbook, or even the particular primary source or whatever the professor gives you, is only one story. And history is not just about one story and one set of dates that lasts forever and doesn't change, but is about an ongoing conversation. And you, by engaging in this conversation, are doing what professional historians do. And that's really exciting. And that makes history more exciting too. Okay. So this is the time when we have our breakout sessions. You will be assigned either to the charisma group. So how could you argue for the importance of the charisma, the prophet, and the revelations as the main reason for the rise of Islam, or the right place and right time group? So how could you, using the maps that I've shown and some other evidence that you can research online, how could you make the argument for the right place and right time? And we'll send you some links and resources for either argument. When you're in the group, you will have two tasks, right? So your task number one will be to choose a primary source or reading from one of these sources, or potentially a map, like the map I showed for this map here. And then I want you to create a discussion activity or an assignment that you could create using this resource, right? What questions could you ask? What discussion prompts could you give potentially to your students? And then I want you to post that on chat, either of these points of view. Just keep in mind, of course, the importance of being sensitive to the religious backgrounds of your students, and also how to maybe bring in the factor of counter evidence, right? So even if you are on the charisma team, how could you get your students to engage with the right place, right time argument, and vice versa? Thank you so much. I mean, it was wonderful to visit some of your breakout sessions and to see what some of you are thinking. It seems like there's an even number saying really interested in maps and facts and figures and economic arguments, wanting to do the right place, right time activity, and then the charisma activity as well for others. I think you could really do both. And then leave it to the student in the end, in the individual assignment, you know, what do you think is the most important, and make an argument for that. And then that leaves it to the student. But I think it's really important to emphasize to students, there is no single right answer here. And that I, as a teacher or a professor, am not going to give you a lower grade because I feel like you chose the wrong approach. Okay. So the other resources, and we'll have to go through these quickly because we don't have much time left in the session, but you'll still be able to look over the slides and find these. The next unit is contact. And Ibn Battuta is really the most fascinating, most exciting way that you can, I think, approach this expansion of the Islamic cultural world. Because what happens in the medieval period, in the life of Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, is you see the political fragmentation of the Islamic world. You see the rise of the Mongols. You see the disintegration of the Abbasid Empire, right? The last Abbasid caliph was killed in 1258. The rivers of the Tigris, and the river of the Tigris in Baghdad was filled with ink and blood from all the books that were thrown, the people that were killed. But something of Islamic culture and society remained, and in some ways remained stronger despite the political instability, despite all the new sultanates and divisions and different warriors who came to rule different islands of power throughout the Islamic world. And what the voyages of Ibn Battuta show is that this world was interconnected, remained interconnected, because he was allowed to and was able to visit, to do commerce, to visit the Sufi shrines. Sufis are the mystics of Islam throughout this world. And he was able to use his credentials as an Islamic scholar and as a judge, a qadi, to find employment and to find places that would host him for free, and even to find wives in multiple locations. He famously married multiple wives. Everywhere he would stop at different places and marry 3 or 4 wives and then go to another place. Not really following Islamic law, even though he was supposed to be a judge, but he would do that. What's interesting is you see the differences in these different geographical environments, that Islam is not a monolithic cultural experience. When Ibn Battuta was in the Maldives Islands, and that archipelago had recently converted to Islam, when he came to shore, the women who greeted him were naked to the waist. Right, so they had, that's one of the first things he did, was to try and institute, well, women need to cover their chest, around me especially. So these encounters, these stories of Ibn Battuta, which are really rich and interesting, can really communicate not just about Islamic history, but about world history as well. And the resources you can use, Berkeley University created this wonderful website, which has the Ibn Battuta as a primary source translated into English. It's freely available that students can read, with pictures and maps of each of the locations that he goes to. So I highly recommend that, especially even if you're teaching medieval history and you want to kind of globalize your medieval history. Ibn Battuta is excellent for that. He traveled far further than Marco Polo, right? I think it was something like 6 times further than Marco Polo. If you really add up all of his journeys circling around, let's get back to that map. You see all the way to China and Africa. And it includes Africa, which is crucial too, because I think we don't really get enough of medieval Africa, of the Mali Empire. Especially in classrooms, in diverse classrooms. I think that's very important to bring out. Mansa Musa, the great king of Mali, converted to Islam and brought so much gold with him that he caused inflation of gold prices in Egypt for 20 years. So on his Hajj to Mecca, just by giving out gold everywhere, so it's not, that it wasn't just slaves and slavery coming out of Africa. I mean, it's important to teach slavery and the history of slavery, but I think sometimes students get this wrong idea that Africa, it's just about slavery. It's not. There's much more to African history than the horrible history of slavery, that there are these magnificent empires and rulers and states and civilizations that came into contact with Islam, or that didn't convert to Islam either. So these are very important resources for you to use. Another idea I have that you can do is use Google Earth to go visit the places that Ibn Battuta visited and ask students to find places that are still around from the time of Ibn Battuta? Like, are there mosques or monuments that are still around? Or what's the evidence of the society that existed in the 14th century continuing to this day, which I think would be really interesting. And then to have them actually visit that location on Google Earth is a fun idea. So you can explore these issues of political disunity, but economic and cultural and religious unity. You don't have to have political unity for these other forms of unity to exist. The role of Sufism, Islamic mysticism, connecting different parts of the Islamic world. Ibn Battuta as an example of the elite versus some of the people that he encounters, and the role of trade and merchants in creating this common society. That, by the way, is a mosque, even though it looks like a pagoda. That's a Chinese mosque, which is really interesting, in Canton, which was the center for many of these Muslim merchants. Another travel log, which you could use as well at other excellent online resources, Nasser Khusro, who is an Ismaili or Shiite traveler. He also provides very rich accounts, somewhat less well-traveled than Battuta, but also a really fascinating way of looking at some of these issues, and not just from a Sunni perspective, but from a Shia perspective as well. If you have time at the very end, you can look at Ibn Khaldun and the continuities, the cycle of history, right? Because Ibn Khaldun believed that history could be seen as a circle of rise and decline of dynasties, right? That they started out as a very vigorous, unified group, rather like Islam itself, of different tribes that came together under one purpose. And then that asabiya, or that sense of social cohesion, eventually declines and falls apart as the elite concentrate resources and power amongst themselves. They don't share it with with their extended followers. So there's a lot of issues that are relevant to this day, and you can talk about this notion of patterns in the past, right? Should we think of history as a line or as a circle? I wrote an article about this that's freely accessible online. I have a link to it. Here, you can even talk about the plague and COVID-19 and these sorts of things, because Ibn Khaldun, this great 14th century historian, he was inspired to write about history, to ask what is the meaning of the past because of the plague, right? Before him, historians just wrote assuming that God made everything happen. So why should we question the past? Because God made it happen, right? Ibn Khaldun said, no, maybe there's something of a human element here, which I think is really fascinating. Other things about history should be a science, a study of cause and effect, and so on. Going back to the Battuta, if you do try and look at the plague, I do encourage you to use this quote from Ibn Battuta. When he was in Damascus, he saw Muslims, Jews, and Christians all appealing to their different gods, and people from different faiths using the name Allah or using Jehovah, and everybody trying to appeal to God to save them from the disease. So disease does not, and the plague does not simply divide groups. There are also instances of people coming together as well, which I think is a really interesting and important message to make, and it can spur some further conversations about tolerance of Christians and Jews within Muslim society, the relatively greater amount of tolerance that was afforded them before the modern era. So I have time. We have some time for questions. And Emma, do you want to talk about how questions are going to happen?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Professor Fromherz, for this great presentation and for sharing these different resources and ideas for different ways of bringing Middle Eastern history into the classes that we teach. So if you do have questions for Professor Fromherz, we ask that you put them in the chat and I will pose them to him. We'll have about 15 minutes for questions, and then we will pivot towards some final comments and notes. There was one question from earlier that I'll just go ahead and post to you now. Somebody had a question about Bedouin societies. And they were reading that the Bedouin were a more egalitarian society than many agricultural sedentary societies of the time. For example, that women were allowed to advise councils that led the Bedouin tribes, or that they were responsible for economic decisions as the men were often at war. The person is asking, is this accurate information? And if you could provide more details to help them have a better understanding of these examples.
Great question. Again, it really depends on context. What's interesting is that you have matrilineal and matriarchal Bedouin societies in the Saharan desert, right? Such as the Tuareg, right, and their ancestors, the Lamtuna and others, the Berbers, where you did have actually the lineage go through the sister and through the woman, and in those cases you did have a higher case of a more matriarchal system existing. Also, there were cases of women of unusually high status before the Prophet Muhammad. Of course, there's the famous example of his first wife, Khadija, who was the one who provided, who was the great merchant and really taught him and took him on his first caravan trip up to Syria and took him under her wing. She was older than he was, right? She saw this strapping, handsome man who was charismatic and said, "Oh, I want that." And she married the Prophet Muhammad, and she was the first convert as well to Islam. The point here, though, is that within these tribal societies, and it is true within Arabia at this time, women were seen as a potential liability because they were not generally put in a position as warriors who could engage in raids of other tribes or could engage in maintaining the honor of your tribe. So if you had a lot of women and you could afford them, it was seen as a great blessing. But if you could not afford them, they were seen as a burden. And for that reason, they were killed. It's not, of course, a justifiable reason, but that's how it happened. And that's how many societies oftentimes would discriminate according to gender when they weren't under this larger system of a rule of law.
Thank you. Another question is somebody seeking resources. They ask, would you recommend pieces of fiction, sound historical fiction that reflect or tell the history at play, i.e. Biographies of the Prophet Muhammad that you could recommend? I will actually extend this question to include any films that you think would be useful.
Yes, there's a very good film called The Message. Now, what's good about this film is it's very sensitive to not actually showing the Prophet Muhammad himself. You may have noticed actually one of my slides does have an image of the Prophet Muhammad. That was a historic text from Ilkhanid, Persia, and it was used to educate the Mongol rulers at the time who wanted to have images. So you can, I think, I would avoid any more recent images of the Prophet Muhammad. I would use only historic images of the Prophet Muhammad. And maybe just, you could mention their provenance as well. Just be very careful not to use, cartoon images of the Prophet, because that could be considered insensitive to some students. But this movie called The Message is actually quite good. It is a little long, but the first 30 to 60 minutes gives you an idea of the type of society that existed in Mecca, of the different tribal gods, and of the trade that was going on in Mecca at the time. it does give you a pretty good idea of the time. And so, I mean, if you have the bandwidth or a period of your class, I would recommend that video potentially. You could also use some of the primary source readings about the Sunnah or the life of the Prophet. Also, Karen Armstrong has a wonderful book on the life of the Prophet, which is a great resource as well. So.
Great, thank you so much, Professor. We have teachers teaching so many different years and eras of history joining us, and a couple people have posed, because of the new emphasis in AP World History on teaching history post 1450, do you have any strategies or tips or suggestions for teaching more modern Middle Eastern history for teachers who are seeking ways to integrate a study of the Middle East from 1450 until our present day?
Yeah, I think that was a big mistake upon AP history to do that, because you can't teach, thank you for agreeing, I see some people, you can't teach modern Islamic history without teaching the rise of Islam. It's just not possible. You can't have one without the other, because constantly the Ottomans and the non-Ottoman Muslims as well are referring to the traditions and the history of the Prophet Muhammad. So if you only focused on the post 1450 story, you would miss everything about what's inspiring people to do certain things, right? Or what the belief structures were, the social structures are. So I think even if you are doing that post 1450 class, you need to at least spend some time on the 5 pillars of Islam, the biography of the Prophet. A very basic, very quick, but you need to do it. Or you're going to have students confused or not understanding, well, why do we have this millet system, for example? Why do we have this way of treating Christians and Jews within the Ottoman Empire? Why do we have these? What are these Islamic? None of them can be explained without referring to the life of the Prophet. So it's ridiculous. I think for teaching modern Middle East, there are many excellent resources, but I would, again, make sure that you refer to previous eras as well. You can use the same. Fordham University has some good resources on there. There's many resources online on the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman maps. I think there's some resources on the Tanzimat reforms, which was this attempt to revive the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century when it was considered the sick man of Europe, and all that. But I think it's important to show the larger arc of history here. So, but thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. And I'll just add that the Middle East Policy Council has a digital book for educators. I'll put it in the chat now, called Teach Mideast. And so if you're looking for more contemporary, more modern themes that you might cover in your history classes, this is a great resource to check. They have writings that are relevant to high school learners, as well as sample lessons and other ideas. So I highly encourage you to check out that resource. Another question that we have, and if you do have any additional last questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We're kind of coming to a close with some of our time for Q&A, but somebody asks if you can elaborate a little bit more on your cycle of history concept. And they're interested in exploring how they might have conversations with students over a line of history versus a circle.
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, the idea that Ibn Khaldun presents is really this notion that societies, dynasties, and states have a certain lifespan, right? And that lifespan is actually, it corresponds roughly to the lifespan of a human individual, and that these dynasties have a birth, a peak, and then a decline over time, and that there's this almost this natural rhythm in this dynastic history. At the same time, though, he also makes the argument, and it's sort of similar to what we've been discussing earlier, that there are certain points in which the cycle is broken, or in which this cycle can be turned into a line in which there can be progress moving forward in history. And guess when that is? That's when you have prophetic revelations, right? When you have some sort of charismatic figure come in and move beyond simply bringing a particular tribe together or a particular larger coalition of tribes together, but really presenting a new idea or a new ideology, a new way of looking at the world. And he sees and that's more of the linear aspect of history. Of course, when we talk about modern historiography, it's very different. We have linear history as the progressive argument, right? This notion of economic development being based on GDP, or the rise of statistics about Jeremy Bentham, the notion of the greatest good for the greatest number. That's more of a progressivist linear argument versus the cyclical argument of the cynics and skeptics, as we are often called, who say, well, there's more to history, and that we shouldn't consider ourselves somehow superior to those in the past. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, of framing, of using Ibn Khaldun as a way of introducing the circular versus the linear patterns of history. So thank you for your question.
Thank you again for being willing to prepare for this presentation, to find these additional resources, and to help us think through ideas of how we might include more Middle Eastern history in our world history classes. Thank you once more for joining us today. We hope that you take advantage of our future offerings of professional development in reputable and relevant content about the Middle East. We thank you all, and we hope that you have a great evening.